Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market by Walter Johnson. Narrated by Tom Perkins. The being of slavery, its soul and its body, lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle. The cart whip, starvation, and nakedness are its inevitable consequences. James W. C. Pennington, The Fugitive Blacksmith. Introduction. A Person with a Price. 19th century New Orleans was, by the breathless account of its boosters, on the verge of becoming one of antebellum America's leading cities, a city to be compared to New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston. What had once been an imperial outpost, passed back and forth between European powers and faraway trades, was, by the early 19th century, a city poised on the brink of commercial greatness. Along the city's waterfront, ships from Europe and around the coast, steamers from the Mississippi River Valley, and thousands of flatboats were packed so tightly that one could walk deck to deck from one end of the city to the other. Stevedores and draymen, white and black, traced out tiny connections in the world economy, unloading and loading, moving goods that had been paper-traded miles away and weeks before, crates of clothes, shoes, and buttons, guns, tobacco, and textiles, china, books, and French wine, cattle, hogs, corn, and whiskey. Salesmen and sailors shouted warnings and instructions in a half-dozen languages. Overhung by the odor of batter-fried fish and pipe smoke, the hopes of the Lower South's leading city were reefed across the broad frontage where the Mississippi met the Atlantic. Thousands of bales of cotton and barrels of sugar, stacked and flagged with the colors of the commission merchants responsible for their sale. And though the city never managed to outrun the underachievement that accounted for the shrill edge of the boosters' accounts, New Orleans was, throughout the antebellum period, unsurpassed in one respect. Not far from the levee was North America's largest slave market. In the same way that contemporary tourists concentrate on a few sites in their visits to see a given city, antebellum travelers and curiosity seekers converged on the slave market when they went south to Louisiana in search of slavery. Rather than making their way out of the city to the sugar plantations that covered the broad alluvial plain at the outlet of the Mississippi, or traveling up river to the cotton plantations strung along the banks from Baton Rouge to Memphis, they began in the neighborhood where today Chartres Street meets broad boulevarded Esplanade, a few short blocks from the levee, past the cathedral and the gin houses and sailors' tenements that served the nearby docks. After the 1840s there was also a slave market further uptown, amidst the shooting galleries, cockpits, barber shops, and boot sellers of the city's central business district. Both of these markets were really clusters of competing firms, each of which in turn maintained its own yard for keeping slaves, slave pens in the parlance of the trade, and frontage for displaying them. Between September and May, the months that bounded the trading season, the streets in front of the pens were lined with slaves dressed in blue suits and calico dresses. Sometimes the slaves paced back and forth. Sometimes they stood atop a small footstand, visible over a crush of fascinated onlookers. As many as 100 slaves might occupy a single block, overseen by a few slave traders whose business was advertised by the painted signs hanging overhead. T. Hart, slaves. Charles Lamarck and Company, Negroes. Here the traveling observers and writers found what they were looking for, a part of slavery that could be used to understand the whole of the institution. Slavery reduced to the simplicity of a pure form, a person with a price. The walls surrounding the pens were so high, 15 or 20 feet, that one New Orleans slave dealer thought they could keep out the wind. Inside those walls the air must have been thick with overcrowding, smoke and shit and lie, the smells of 50 or 100 people forced to live in a space the size of a home lot. and the sounds that came over the walls from the street outside must have been muted and mixed. Horses' hooves striking the stone-paved street, cart wheels and street cars, fragments of conversation, laughter, shouting. Along the inside walls were privies, kitchens, dressing rooms, and jails. The jails were sometimes as many as 3 stories high and built of brick. They looked like the slave quarters that can be seen today in the yards of many New Orleans houses, steep-backed, 1 room deep, and fronted with railed galleries. In the 19th century slave pens, however, those galleries were lined with barred windows and doors that locked from the outside. Behind the doors were simple rooms with bare pine floors and plain plastered walls. Measuring 10 or 12 feet across, they were intended for multiple occupancy. On the ground floor of one of the jails or across the yard were offices and a showroom. The traders' offices were probably the type of spaces where nobody sat down, places for drinking, pacing, signing, and counting. The real business took place in the showrooms, which were large enough for 100 slaves to be arrayed around their walls, questioned and examined. These rooms had finished floors and painted walls, a fireplace, a few chairs, and doors all around. A door from the offices where the traders did their counting and signing, a door from the street where the buyers gathered before the pens opened, and a door from the yard where the slaves waited to be sold. What follows is the story of these showrooms. It is a story of back-and-forth glances and estimations, of hushed conspiracies and loud boasts, of power, fear, and desire, of mistrust and dissimulation, of human beings broken down into parts and recomposed as commodities, of futures promised, purchased, and resisted. It is in no small measure the story of antebellum slavery. The bargains, sealed in the New Orleans slave pens, were centuries in the making, late additions to a 400-year history by which the trade in African and African-descended people transformed the New World. By the end of the 15th century, Portuguese merchants and soldiers had dotted 4,000 miles of the west coast of Africa with outposts, where they traded for slaves to export to sugar and wine-producing islands off the coast. The Portuguese were shortly followed to Africa by the other imperial powers of Europe, the Spanish in the 16th century, the Dutch, Danes, French, and English in the 17th. Beginning in the 1650s, when sugar planted on Barbados and in Brazil began to grow into huge profits for colonial planters and metropolitan shippers, the African trade was a central concern of Europe's colonial powers, each of which attempted to control it through exclusive licensing and colonial customs. The word for the economic theory behind the trade has come down to us scrubbed clean by usage: mercantilism. Colonial staples, shipped from abroad and finished at home, would yield metropolitan profits, which would be shared with the monopoly-granting state. And colonial markets would consume domestic manufactures, profits again dutied and taxed into state revenue. In practice, this meant that well-connected investors could form themselves into syndicates like the Royal African Company and the Dutch West India Company, and receive monopoly license from their governments to pursue trade in other parts of the world, license to make war on non-Christian kings and to snatch or purchase their subjects along the shores of a distant continent, license to have their slave trade monopolies protected by governmental decree, and their African coast slave factories defended in European wars. Though punctuated by imperial conflict and political regulation, the trade's 4 centuries were, by and large, charted along the demand curves for colonial staples: tobacco, indigo, rice, cotton, coffee, and especially sugar. There was direct trade among the colonies and between the colonies and Europe, but much of the Atlantic trade was triangular: slaves from Africa, sugar from the West Indies and Brazil, money and manufactures from Europe. People were traded along the bottom of the triangle. Profits would stick at the top. In the 4 centuries of that triangular trade, 10 to 11...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?